start, and if we have some problems, technical problems with simultaneous translation, I think it will be solved in a few minutes. But I think if we all speak English for the moment, I think it will be a solution. But I still hope that the simultaneous interpretation will be okay. Okay, so Даш, тогда можно отключать. So, Nitin, please start.
Thank you, Olga. Greetings, colleagues. My name is Nitin Umapati. I am from the World Bank Social Protection Practice, and I'm your moderator for this session. I would like to welcome you to the 22nd April conference organized by the Higher School of Economics and the Human Capital Multidisciplinary Research Center, which is a consortium of 4 leading Russian research organizations created as part of the President's initiative to develop world-class research centers in Russia. This conference is also organized in partnership with the International Association for Research in Income and Wealth. So, as moderator, I need to inform you of a few housekeeping things to keep in mind. First is that this session is being recorded and will be later posted online. If you have any objections to this, then please turn off your video. Second, the schedule is very tight with little room for overtime slippages, so I will try to make sure everything is flowing by giving a 3-minute to finish heads up to the speaker, and would appreciate greatly if you can ensure your presentations are on time. So thank you for your understanding. The presentations are 15 minutes long and will be followed with 5 minutes for questions and answers. I encourage you all to post your questions in the chat, and I will read them out at the end of each session in the same order as they come. So without further delay, let's go. We have an exciting session about the status of well-being and health with a focus on former Soviet Union countries today. This is important and interesting as a way to take stock of progress made so far, but also to guide what could be done to the redistribution system in this region in the future. Our first session is by Professor Louis Chavel from University of Luxembourg on growing wealth inequalities and their consequences on health gradient in Russia and 8 other countries. So Professor Chavel, over to you, and I will let you know when we're close to the end of the session. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your introduction, invitation, etc. Time is very short, so I will not be as polite as I should, but and begin immediately with the topic. Indeed, the topic is about wealth inequalities and its consequences in terms of well-being, in particular in terms of health gradient of the population. I precise that I don't work alone on this topic. It's a team in Luxembourg, Francisco Serron, Emily Murphy, Jason Settles. We all work on topics of stratification and inequality in a comparative perspective. I just insist on the fact that Luxembourg looks like a very small country, but it's a very big world empire of research on income inequality due to the Luxembourg Income Study group that helps archive different data. So time is short, I repeat, so I will not introduce too much too long this topic. This topic is at first to understand how wealth affects more and more the population. You will find, it's not a link, but I will circulate the link of my presentation so that you will have this link, clickable link to the Journal of Chinese Sociology, where Zletana, who will speak in some minutes, wrote a text too. It's about wealth is back. The fact that in many countries, at first in the US, but almost everywhere on the planet, wealth is an increasing part of realities, of social realities, and in terms of social mobility, it's an issue. And my aim here is to compare different Western countries to available data sets. Thank you very much to the Higher School of Economics for its panel of Russian longitudinal monitoring survey that is extremely useful for international comparison, but I will not insist too much. The topic here is about wealth inequalities and the connections to health inequalities, and the conclusion number one is health and wealth are intrinsically connected. And the second important topic is that at this stage, what we see from Russia in the data is different to what we see in different countries. It certainly means that social class structure in Russia is coming or becoming. I will skip almost all this slide simply because we have no time. The general topic is about wealth is important to understand social realities. Education is important, income is important, but if we neglect the specific role of wealth, we could lose something. And this slide indeed is common to several papers we are developing in Luxembourg at this time, because the general point is that we have neglected wealth. And since wealth inequalities are back at the top of socioeconomic pyramid, we have to understand better the specific role of wealth at this time. So the general issue is that, let's say, in this case, health is something like a composition of education plus income plus occupational.
Louis, we don't hear you. Please, microphone. Louis, we don't hear you. Louis, on ne vous entend pas.
I had been muted by someone. I don't know why. Indeed, I had been muted recently, or from the beginning of my talk?
No. Recently for,
okay, so
10 seconds, 15 seconds like this.
Yeah, it's very difficult to have a feedback all the time with
and
that
your
kind
presentation.
of tool. So I try reach again where I am. So indeed, you have here the kind of thing we are currently doing. We work, for instance, here it's the US. This is the US. You have here 3 dimensions. Education, it's a cube. Education is this axe. So the facet that is here is most educated people. Here is income. So you see it's a cube. The hidden facet is on the other way is richest in income, and the vertical axe is wealth. This means that this facet here is for the richest. And here you have people who are rich in income, in wealth, and in education. And here you have those who are poor in education, income, and wealth. And if I may insist, so red is the healthiest part of the population. So it's good to be rich in income, wealth, and education. And blue is for those who are the poorest in health. And those ones are typically those with less income, less wealth, less everything. So I don't know. I have I have something back in my ears. I don't. I hope I don't have to consider. I just add that. Yeah. For instance, in the chat, you see the chat. I circulate this link. Yes, on the chat, where you can have fun on your own with this cube. You see this cube? I try not to lose too much time. So it's an animated 3-dimensional graph. Red are the healthy ones, blue are the unhealthy one, and the 3 dimensions of the cube are income, education, and wealth. IEW, income, education, wealth. You see the point. So what you see in the US, because it's the US, and you have the same thing for many countries, we detect the degree to which inequalities of income, education, and wealth have impact on health. Just to go back to my PowerPoint, with Teams, it's not entirely easy for me, but yeah. So here you have this I precise. Indeed, in this cube, you have 5 dimensions in the reality. Blue and red is health. You have the social gradient of income, education, and wealth. And on top of that, the size of the bubbles on the cube are proportional to the number of the individuals in that part of the cube. This means that those who are high in income and education are not so many to have no wealth. The vertical axis here is wealth plus wealth minus. Those with no wealth, those people are not, those people here, it's a small bubble. You don't have so many people who are rich in income, rich in education, but poor in wealth. So what you see is the standard gradient of the 3 variables: income, education, and wealth. And the topic of this paper is typically this. I still have 5 minutes, so I have to hurry up, but you have an important part of the elements. From the Luxembourg Wealth Study, we retrieved 34 samples with almost 1 million individuals, selected between age 25 and 60. We have all the variables we need: wealth, education, income, plus health, plus the rest of social demographics. And we work at the level of households. And what we focus on is health. Indeed, we work on the age-adjusted self-assessed health status, people who feel healthy or feel unhealthy. And indeed, we adjust it by age because health declines mechanically with age. And so all the variables, education, income, wealth, are age adjusted, simply because you have life cycle effects that we want we try to have permanent wealth, income, education is permanent almost by definition. And we try to do exactly the same thing with the Higher School of Economics panel. After selection, we have 60,000 individuals, and yeah, once again, so what we show with Luxembourg Wealth Survey is that many capitalist countries, long-term capitalist countries, have a very strong income plus education plus wealth polarization. You have a strong socioeconomic gradient of health based on the 3 variables. That is, whatever the level of education and wealth, what you see is that even if those people are not so many, people with no wealth here are bad in health, and they're always better in health when they have a big deal of wealth. So whatever the direction in the cube, you have a huge gradient of income, education, and education health in the US. This is the US. In many countries, the worst case, so it's the strongest case of gradient is from the United Kingdom. Here you will be able to play with the cube. The rich in education, income, and wealth are the healthiest, and the poorest in education, wealth, and health, and the three variables combine. I'm sorry, I'm very repetitive. The very interesting thing when you work on Russia, I tried build a variable that is wealth level through the Russian dataset. What we see at this stage in 2019, but I have the different years, is that the rich in education, income, and wealth, those at the top of the three quintiled variables, are not that healthy. They are simply average. The healthiest related to their generation, to their age group, are people with low education, with lower income, but high wealth. It's wealthy seniors when you analyze this population. And the other part of the healthy population are high education and high income people with low wealth, and typically it's what you find in the group of younger professionals. This means that the structure of inequalities of health, the gradient, the socio-economic gradient of wealth explained by the three variables, for the moment are not structured like in old Western capitalist countries. At this stage, Russia has a kind of bimodal healthy part of the population, old seniors with wealth and no income, and younger professionals who don't have access to wealth at this time. So I have 30 seconds, sorry, it's my dream, but I have 30 seconds to express more what we did in the paper. For the 42 samples, we analyze the specific role of education, wealth, and income in the explanation of health. And just to give the main results, the UK and the US are highly structured, and at this stage, Japan and Russia are less structured. I will finish in 2 seconds. We can analyze the specific role of wealth, very strong in the UK, of income, particularly strong in the UK and the US, and the role of education, where Luxembourg is a bit specific. The UK very clear as higher educational coefficient. And just to say, for the moment, Russian gradient of health is in the making progressively. When you analyze Western countries, let's say the US and Europe, the gradient is extremely clear. When you work on Japan and Russia, you see this gradient of education, income, and wealth on health is much less organized, crystallized, if you want, like than in Europe and the US. We can suspect that the structuration of income, education, and wealth will come at some point in Russia, simply because, yes, and I have eaten most of my time and I will be silenced soon. Just to finish with, let's say this work is in the making. And we hope that in the next years, months, we'll find even more interesting and robust things with concerning Russia. That's it. Thank you for your patience and for this invitation that is extremely positive for me. Thanks a lot for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Chauvel. This is very interesting. And I don't see questions in the chat box, so I will ask my own question. It's an interesting finding that the best predictor of health in Russia, at least, unlike other Western countries, is wealth, but not so much education and not so much level of income. So this is a very interesting outcome because usually older cohorts have more wealth and younger cohorts have lower wealth. And so you would imagine that actually health outcomes would be the other way around. No, not the other way around, but that income should be still a strong predictor of health. Is there any hypothesis what explains this in Russia?
Main hypothesis I have at this stage is interactions. I mean that when you analyze the Western countries I spoke of, it's very simple. The three dimensions, education, income, and wealth, are cumulative somehow, and the effects are relatively linear. At this stage, the complexity with Russia is that you have to understand the interactions with three variables: income, education, and wealth, to understand the social groups that have more that are healthier relative to their age group. Less, not so educated, but and not so income rich, but wealthy people are better than the rest of their own generation, and conversely, young professionals don't really have wealth accumulated at this stage because they are too young to have saved money or inherited from the resources of their parents. So what you see on the Russian cube is that it's not linear. The UK and the US and other countries cube is very linear in three dimensions with no big problem of interactions. What you see when you move the three-dimensional cube you have from Russia is that, okay, those with no wealth, no income, no education are not very well in general, but you have a complicated interaction between the three variables. At this stage, I don't doubt that in 20 years there will be a stabilization of more money in the family, higher incomes and higher diploma will converge on the same households and individuals. But the explanation is, and the cube gives this explanation, this vision. It's important to understand the interaction to catch the point. No linear analysis with no interaction is able to catch the Russian complexity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome,
so,
thank you.
Colleagues, we're going to move to the next presentation. And again, questions should be put in the chat box if you have them. Our next presentation is by Daria Popova from University of Essex and Higher School of Economics on the distributional impact of taxes and benefits in 8 post-Soviet countries. Daria, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully now you can see my presentation. Oops. Can you see it?
It's taking some time.
Yes, we can see it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The problem is that I only see the first slides myself. So I'm not sure if it's gonna work. Okay, let me try to do it again.
Now it's okay. We are.
But do you see it full screen?
Yeah. MS Teams is very slow, so it takes some seconds more to switch.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Please go ahead. Maybe you can start and then the screen will activate, just so that we don't lose more.
Yeah, there's so many slides and I can't see them myself. So, okay. I'll open it here. So can you see my slides now?
Yes, we can see the beginning slide. The first one.
The first one. Great. So I have, so this paper is actually with my co-authors from the World Bank, Alan Fuchs, Mikhail Matitsyn, and Natsuko Kizunazaki. And we are looking at the distributional impact of taxes and benefits in post-Soviet countries. And now, please let me know if I move to the next slide and you can see the next one. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Okay, so I think it's a bug, technical bug, and I'm not sure.
Дарья, там бывает проблема, когда раскрываешь на полный экран в режиме демонстрации. Можно просто его не разворачивать на полный экран, и тогда слайды будут видны. То есть, если сейчас у вас на экране там идет режим демонстрации, то у нас могут не переключаться слайды, такое бывает.
Я вижу просто пустой слайд, я не вижу вообще.
Он задумывается надолго.
У нас тоже пустой слайд.
So I'm really sorry about this technical issue.
Может быть, еще раз
на полный экран, просто запустить боковой панелью. То есть не на полный экран.
Из режима демонстрации.
Да, из режима демонстрации выйти. Потом осталась боковая панель сбоку, он вроде бодрее работает. Вот мы вчера тестировали.
Okay, it seems that I'm not going to be able to show it, or maybe now.
Вот, да, сейчас переключается, все отлично.
Perfect. I'm really sorry. I'm very, very bad with Microsoft Teams. I don't work with it normally. Okay. So the motivation for this study is basically a huge information gap in terms of the performance of the welfare states in the region of Eastern Europe in general, and the former Soviet Union countries in particular. And our aim in this paper is to assess the impact of the welfare states, including all taxes and benefits, in reducing inequality and poverty in post-Soviet countries in a comparative way. And our contributions to the literature are as follows. So first, we would like to examine the actual outcomes as opposed to studies that look at institutional indicators. We estimate the impact of all welfare state policies, including the part which is usually hidden from the analysis, and this relates to indirect taxes and in-kind transfers, such as public education and healthcare. And we do it in a fully comparative framework of fiscal incidence analysis using the approach developed by Nora Lastic at the Commitment to Equity Institute. So this slide summarizes this approach. Just to say briefly that fiscal incidence analysis is as an exercise that we do using the household survey data, and we allocate taxes and transfers to certain individuals in the survey. And we compute several income concepts such as market income, the income after direct transfers, indirect taxes, and social insurance contributions. This is called disposable income. Then on top of that, we include, we simulate indirect subsidies and indirect taxes and arrive at post-fiscal or consumable income. And then we add on top of that in-kind transfers and arrive at the concept of final income. Of course, we use a number of assumptions to do these simulations, and our analysis largely relies on the information on social transfers and taxes reported in the survey. So our data do not match the totals in national accounts, and we are not aiming for this sort of match. So we are doing this mainly for the distributional analysis. Okay, so this research is based on individual studies that were done for these post-Soviet countries by the country teams of the World Bank. And we, so if anyone is interested in individual studies, the links are on this slide. Now I'm going to say a few words about the, prehistory, just to give some sort of a background, but I'm going to do it very quickly, assuming that I have only 13 minutes and I've spent a lot of time on fixing my PowerPoint. First, I want to point out that at the large gap between the countries at the onset of the market transition, and we can see here that the GDP per capita in Russia was twice as high as in the second most successful country, Republic of the former Soviet Union, it's Belarus. And this gap still persists nowadays. We can see that it's the inequality is still huge. The poverty has surged right after the beginning of the market transition. And then we can also observe, the reduction in poverty and almost to zero in some countries. But it's still quite high levels in the three countries in our sample. So plus you have to take into account that it's a very low poverty line, $3.2 USD per day. This is much lower than the let's say national poverty threshold adopted in Russia. In terms of inequality, we do not see inequality reduction as opposed to poverty. Inequality surged and then remained at a very similar level throughout the period and observation the last 20 years. So after all, we have a very heterogeneous group of countries. There's one high-income country, it's Russian Federation. There's one middle-income country, and the rest of the countries included in the study. So these are Armenia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, and Ukraine. They are classified as low and middle-income countries. And now I'm going to move on to actually the main results of our study. So this picture shows the reduction in Gini coefficient and in poverty head count due to taxes and transfers. So from here we move from market income, these are this blue markers, and here it's for poverty as well, to disposable income and then to consumable income and to final income. So we don't do the same for poverty. For poverty, we stop at the consumable income because the poverty line does not include the equivalent, the cost of in-kind services. So we don't compute this concept. So we can see that in all the countries there is a considerable reduction in inequality, mainly due to direct taxes and transfers, and the same applies to poverty. And one thing that deserves attention is basically that this consumable income inequality, so these are gray dots on the slide, sometimes is higher than the disposable income inequality. This means that after indirect taxes are applied, deducted from the disposable income, the inequality gets higher than it was given the impact of direct taxes and transfers. So it's not a unique finding. It does happen in low and middle income countries quite often, but it's important to point this out. This is especially important as far as poverty is concerned, because we can see here that the gap is actually quite high. So in countries like Moldova and Georgia, the indirect taxes increase poverty considerably. And again, I just want to point out that there is quite a big difference between the initial levels of market income inequality in these countries, and in terms of redistribution, there's also a great variation.
Daria, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, I'll show you quickly this slide where we have summarized the redistributive impact of taxes and transfers at the consumable income. And here we can see that we have several clear leaders like Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and Moldova performing better in terms of reducing inequality, and countries like Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine performing better in terms of poverty headcount. So I'm going to skip these figures because apparently I have only 2 minutes. So I'm going to go to conclusions and just say briefly the main findings regarding the impact of various components of the tax benefit systems. So in our study, we can see that the tax structures in these countries vary significantly, and this reflects different stages of development of the fiscal systems in these countries. But overall, there is a very high reliance on indirect taxes. The tax system, because of this high reliance on indirect tax, the tax systems are mostly regressive, and poverty and inequality increasing. And it can also be attributed to really low revenues from personal income taxes, but due to the flat structures of personal income taxes. And regarding transfers, our conclusion at the moment is that basically there is the potential to reduce poverty by increasing social spending. This social spending on social transfers in particular, on means-tested transfers, are quite low as compared to advanced welfare states. With some exceptions, like Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus. This is happening to low revenues, while in Russia, actually, it is a policy choice. We can see impact. We can see positive impact on poverty and inequality reducing impact of direct taxes almost everywhere, and mostly neutral impact of in-kind transfers, education and healthcare. But I have to add again that we have this sort of one point in time analysis, so it's a snapshot of 1 year, and our analysis does not include any behavioral or general equilibrium effects. Of course, we know that education and health are expenditures that are very important from the point of view of social development. So I'm going to stop here and happy to answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you, Daria. We'll be having a Q&A session after the next presentation. So please, the next presentation is by Elena Nazarbayeva. It's on multidimensional poverty index adapted to Russian data and with the resulting poverty profiles. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. The presentation was prepared together with my colleagues from Higher School of Economics, Alina Bishnyak and Natalia Halina. and the presentation is devoted to multidimensional poverty index. Now there are a lot of approaches for poverty evaluation, but all of them can be divided into monetary and non-monetary approaches. And as they first focus mainly on income criteria, the non-monetary approaches take into account rather large sets of deprivations, and they become more and more popular. And multidimensional poverty index is a case of implementation of such methodology. And in our research, we show how such index can be constructed on Russian data and how it can widen our vision of poverty. Russia seems to be a good example to make some such exercise, as in Russia, poverty line was quite changeable during last years. Nowadays, the poverty line is set at 44.2% of median income of population, but this transition was made only this year, and before the poverty line was based on evaluation of subsistence minimum level, and the composition of it somehow changed also. But the core idea is that all the time only monetary criteria were put in identification of the poor. But now it's rather evident that the problem of poverty can't be reduced to the lack of income only. That's why we moved to so-called MPI, or multidimensional poverty index. There are a lot of indicators, but we focus this one. To build this index, several steps should be taken. First of all, one should set a list of deprivations that accompany poverty, and for each deprivation, the criteria of suffering from it should be chosen. For example, if we suppose that poor people suffer from lack of pure water, the criteria can be like having the source with pure water in 30 minutes walk from house. After the list of deprivations is ready, all of them are grouped into dimensions or domains, and each domain gets its own weight. The weight reflects the importance of each domain in the problem of poverty. And the weight of each domain is when they divided among the deprivations it includes. Finally, for each person, the sum of weights of deprivation he or she suffers from is compared with a threshold, and if the sum of the weights is higher than this threshold, one is considered to be poor. If it's lower, then he or she is considered to be not poor. And the MPI itself is the result of dividing the total weights of deprivations for the poor by the number of all respondents. We can have a look at the structure of MPI used by Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Here you can see 3 poverty dimensions: health, education, and living standards, and each of them includes several deprivations. For example, if we look at health domain, we see that it includes nutrition and child mortality. If we speak about the nutrition, it's evaluated by weight index and height by age index for children. If we speak about child mortality, the criteria is the following. During 5 years prior to the survey, in the household, a child died. The authors of initial index suppose that there is no unique index composition, as the situation of poverty is also unique in each case. As we can see, for example, the problem of nutrition may be not as serious in Russia. So we need the index that reflects the Russian problems. The other problem is that we can't replicate any foreign index on Russian data. And due to that, several combinations of deprivations and domains were tested on statistical survey of income and participation in social programs. And you can see the final composition of index. I think we should also mention that there are a lot of deprivations. They lie in the fields of health, education, and material well-being. But the latter category is includes the most of deprivations. So we decided to construct more domains, and each deprivation has rather comparable weight. When choosing the threshold, different methodologies can be applied, but we follow the idea that the share of poor should be similar to the share of poor in accordance with relative poverty approach. And in our case, we suppose that one should suffer from deprivations from 3 or more domains to be considered poor. In this case, we get the poverty headcount at 24.8, and the MPI index is 7.7. And as you can see on the slide, the groups of poor identified in accordance with different approaches overlap, but they do not coincide. And as you can see, only about 10% of all population are poor in accordance with any approach. MPI is also useful to compare the poverty situation for different groups of population. For example, if we look at different age groups, we can see that older people have higher MPI index, or they suffer from poverty more. If we look at the distribution by education level, we can see that the most vulnerable groups are people with incomplete secondary and no secondary education. And if we look at professional status, we see that unskilled workers are the most vulnerable group and have the highest MPI index. We can also have a look at the index at household level. Then we see that the highest indices are at rural areas, and the large households also suffer from poverty more. And we can see that the problem is even more serious for large families with many children, 3 and more children. We should also mention that most of the profiles identified by MPI are rather similar to poverty profiles identified in accordance with absolute poverty approach. But as we've seen above, index is rather high for older people, and in accordance with absolute poverty, the share of poor among them is rather low. Index can be also useful to compare different groups with each other. For example, if we use the index, we can see that there are some groups with highest index and with most serious problems. At the individual level, these are unskilled workers and people with low education. If we look at household level, we see that a lot of problems are seen for families with unemployed members, with families with children, and families with disabled members. We can also compare the profiles of groups identified in accordance with absolute and MPI approach and see who is poor only by MPI or only by absolute approach. We see that retired and older people are often only MPI poor, as well as people living alone. And if we move to absolute approach only, we see that among the poorest are large households and couples with children. Probably it can be explained by economy on scale. While large families can buy some durables, but if we look at their income, the income per capita appears to be relatively low. What else can be done with the index? As you know, Russia is a rather large country and we have a lot of regions. And the index provides useful information for comparative analysis for the regions. As you can see on the slide, the share of poor people identified according to the absolute approach and poor people identified to NPI differ. And even when some regions have similar shares of absolutely poor, the share of NPI poor for them varies significantly. And this provides the ability to build new hypotheses about the regional differences. And I think I can move to the conclusion. And just to sum up briefly, NPI index for us seems to be a very useful instrument to be used in addition to well-known poverty indicators. And it shows that among groups with high risk of poverty are low-educated people, low-skilled workers, and older people. And it also demonstrates that households living in rural areas, large households, and people with three or more children, families with three or more children, are also at high risks of poverty. And the index widens somehow our perception of poverty, adding to the poor, retired people, and disabled people. They relatively rare, are supposed to be poor when we speak in terms of official approach to poverty measurement in Russia. And it seems to us that NPI could be very important when we speak about social support measures. Because first of all, it helps to identify the groups of poor who fell out of the scope of social policy. And if we look at the structure of NPI, I mean, at the domains that include the NPI, we can also see the sharpest problems that people face. I think that's all. Thank you for the attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have a couple of questions, and the first question is to Daria Popova. What will be the suggestions to further fiscal policy in Russia? Increasing social transfers or imposing progressive taxes?
To put it shortly, both. So apparently there is room both for increasing the progressivity in the tax system and also increasing the social expenditure on transfers. We can see it's obvious from this analysis, but we also have shown it multiple times using microsimulation model for Russia that introduction of more progressive taxation would definitely help in reducing poverty and inequality. So that's, I guess, the major issue. Thank you for this question. It's that would be my answer.
And the second question is, would it be possible to compare with other cases of successful transition countries like Chile? I will verbatim read out. It says, very different historically, but with a new welfare state.
Yeah, thank you very much for the suggestion. It is possible to use for comparison any countries that use this the CQ methodology. So as long as you have access to the original studies, it's possible. I don't have access to the Chilean data, but as far as I know, at some point the CQ Institute wanted to publish the data, the original studies, and if not the original data, but the DO files. So I guess it will vary by country. but that's what they want to do. But with COVID and so on, it's not clear when they're going to be able to do that. Thank you.
And one last question then. I'm not going to read, there was one question in between for Louis Chavel, but it was answered in the chat, so I will skip that one and I will go to the next one, which is to Elena Nazarbayeva. What is the difference between MPI and classical deprivation approach, particularly developed in Russia?
Yeah, thank you for the question. These indices are rather similar, but when we look at MPI, the difference could be in the usage of weights. We here demonstrated rather simple, let's say, implementation of the index, and we can also add some weights for domains and deprivations, and in this case we take into account the importance of problem or of the groups of problem.
Okay, great. Since we're actually over time, maybe we should take this opportunity to go to the next presentation to gain some of that time. And the next presentation is by Svetlana Marieva. Does the tunnel effect still apply? Social mobility and perceptions of inequality in the new Russia.
Okay, thank you. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Okay, great. So I'm happy to present our work on social mobility and perceptions of inequality in the new Russia. This study was carried out by me and my colleagues, Ekaterina Slobodinyuk and Vasily Anikin, who are also present here today. So our study addresses the issue of the interrelation between social mobility and perceptions of inequality that are known as the tunnel effect in contemporary Russia. As we all know, inequality remains a key challenge of the socio-economic development, and the population's subjective perception of inequality is also gaining more significance. As for the social mobility, the topic of social mobility enriches the analysis of the inequality issue because it can affect the population's attitude towards them. The relationship between social mobility on one hand and inequality and society's tolerance for inequalities and the demand for redistribution on the other hand is conceptualized in the academic literature through several assumptions. The most well-known of them is the tunnel effect and the prospect of upward mobility. So according to Hirschman, tolerance for inequalities will be higher if the population notices social mobility in society, even if the social mobility doesn't yet affect them personally. He called this the tunnel effect, and he used the analogy of the cars that are stuck in a traffic jam in a tunnel. So if the cars in the second lane begin to move, and drivers in the first lane think that see this as an encouraging signal for themselves, and think that they too will soon move. There is also an assumption about a lower demand for distribution among low-income citizens, but those who expect that their children or themselves will have higher than average income in the future. So this is the hypothesis of the prospect of upward mobility. These assumptions have been tested for Russia, but only in the 90s. And in the 90s, Russia underwent significant socioeconomic transformation that led to a sharp increase both in inequality and social mobility. And empirical tests demonstrated that at that time there was a correlation between social mobility and tolerance for inequalities. And it was particularly noticed among the most well-off individuals. Their demand for their distribution was considerably higher among them if they had pessimistic expectations about their future. However, since then, socioeconomic realities in Russia have changed quite dramatically. We have seen decrease in poverty, we have seen growth of the middle strata, we have seen higher standards and quality of living for the mass population. At the same time, I have to say that inequality remains comparatively high, especially against the background of the European countries, but it is lower than in Latin America or other BRICS countries. So we raised the question of how pronounced the tunnel effect is in current socioeconomic realities in Russia. And do experienced and expected mobility affect support for distribution? Do they have the same effect, or does this effect vary? But first, let's turn to the public perception of inequalities. According to the data, we can see that perception of inequalities and the demand for distribution in Russia remain quite similar to the situation in the 90s. So this socioeconomic development that I have mentioned have not led to any significant changes in this regard. We can say that existing inequalities are seen as excessively deep and excessively unfair, and the conflict between the rich and the poor is seen as the main conflict in Russian society, and it is seen as much more important than typical class conflicts between workers and employees, for example. So since the 90s, we are seeing the picture which is very close to the situation in the 90s, and the only change is that there is more and more polarization of the views of Russia. So Russians are more clear on their positions towards inequalities. It is also very important to notice that such perceptions in Russian society are universal for the entire population. They do not vary with education level, with the level of human capital, or with income. So these assumptions are shared by the whole population. Against the background of other countries, and not only United States of America or Nordic countries, but European countries as well, including East Europe, we can see that Russia is characterized by the very high demand for redistribution. So our question is, do experience or expectations of mobility differentiate this demand? Our main hypothesis, based on the data that I have shown, is that the tunnel effect was present in the early stages of the country's post-reform development, because at that time, population expected further changes in the population, and it was ready for a temporary increase in inequality. So the tolerance for inequalities were higher. However, high inequality is persistent in the country for the last 2 decades, and also an extreme concentration of income and wealth in the hands of a very small top elite group. And these factors could lead to disappointment and stabilization of the demand for redistribution at a high level, despite the directions of expected or experienced mobility. So to test this hypothesis, we use several variables that are presented at this slide. If the tunnel effect is still present in Russian society, we should observe a statistically significant correlation between mobility and demand for redistribution. We work with a subjective intergenerational mobility. We do not look at the intergenerational mobility. So we look at the experienced mobility in the last 5 years, mobility that is expected in the next 10 years, and both of these types of mobility are based on the self-evaluation of the social position on the scale from 1 to 10 at the time of the survey, 5 years before, and expected position in 10 years. We divide this scale from 1 to 10 into 3 categories: low status, middle status, and high status, and we treat mobility as transition between the statuses. And we also use a proxy for short-term expected mobility, meaning the expectation of changes in the material situation over the next year. So we have experience of mobility, we have expected mobility in 1 year, and we have expected mobility in 10 years. We also include in our analysis subjective notions of inequality. And among these subjective notions are preferences for equality of opportunities or equality of income, attitudes towards progressive taxation, and assessment of the depth and fairness of the inequality that currently exists in the country. We work on the Russian subset of the SSP data, and we have added additional questions to this wave, so it's a little bit broader than the usual SSP questionnaire. We start with the basic model. I'm sorry, but a few words, I have to say a few words on the directions of mobility. And in factual experienced mobility, immobility is prevalent. About 2/3 of Russians do not see any noticeable changes in their situation as compared to their position 5 years ago. As for the socially mobile population, downward mobility is more prevalent in comparison to the upward mobility. As for expected mobility, situation seems paradoxical. On one hand, people mostly expect their financial situation to worsen in the next year. More than half of population said that they expect the situation to worsen. But on the other hand, when we talk about situation in 10 years, individuals have much more positive prospects. So the Russians tend to believe in a better, however distant future, despite past experiences and despite pessimistic short-term expectations. So we started with a basic model that included a set of individual social, demographic, and income characteristics. Then we added into our model experienced and expected mobility in midterm, and then we compared it to adding short-term mobility, and it worked better. We also added subjective notions of inequality, and they also increased the quality of the model. So here I present the results of our final model. And what is interesting here? First of all, we see absence of the significance of demographic characteristics of gender, age, education, or type of settlement. So the demand for the redistribution, as I've mentioned above, is universal in different social demographic groups. As for the experienced and expected mobility in midterm, they also didn't show an effect on demand for redistribution. In this respect, short-term expected mobility, so expected mobility over the next year, worked better, and we can see that it mostly works in terms of downward mobility. So the pessimistic expectations about financial situation in the next year increases the demand for redistribution quite significantly. And also, what is important to notice is that the results of our model generally confirm the assumption that subjective categories, including attitudes towards inequality, are best explained by other subjective categories, primarily normative ideas of a fair social order and its correlation with reality. So whether this fair social order is really seen in contemporary Russian reality. We can see that all the settings and perceptions have their significant effect on the demand for redistribution. So the demand for redistribution in modern Russia is based on such notions and not on the individual characteristics and individual situation. And that includes actual or expected mobility. So it is this demand for redistribution is a part of a general model of what society should be and what it is in reality. Only short-term expectations about one's unstable situation, and it should be called probably not mobility, but volatility of the situation, have significant effect in this respect. So why we can see that despite dramatic socioeconomic changes that took place in Russia, despite the increase in living standards, despite the decrease in poverty, the perception of inequality has not undergone any major transformation since the 90s. Most Russians still think that inequalities are excessively high and unfair. The gap between rich and poor is very big. It is considered to be more critical, and the demand for redistribution is also universal. And these perceptions are not differentiated by socio-demographic characteristics, education, income, and the impact of mobility is also very limited. Neither the experienced mobility in the past or expected mobility in the future significantly affect this demand for redistribution. So the classic tunnel effect in Russia cannot be seen currently. The only aspect is that volatility in the next year. What can be the explanation of this situation? We have several ideas about that. First of all, as noted in the literature, tunnel effect and high tolerance for inequalities can be seen at the first stages of fundamental changes, when the population is ready to put up with growing inequalities, but expect that the situation will change over time. For Russia, however, the period of reforms ended quite a long time ago, but the configuration of inequality didn't change. So it changed mostly at the lower end of distribution when we talk about poverty, but not at the top. And if we talk about the top part of the inequality, there remains, and it is growing, a big gap between the wealthy few, a very small group, and the rest of the population. We have very high concentration of income and wealth, and in this respect, Russia is among the world leaders of inequality if we measure inequality by concentration. So in this condition, even one's personal experience or expectations of mobility do not change the general ideas about the situation, and that is quite unacceptable. In addition, the instability of mass prosperity that we can be seen in Russia.
Sorry to interrupt, you have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm finishing, thank you. In addition, we have quite high income mobility in Russia compared to European countries. It is typical for the countries in transformation. And we can see that mass well-being, objective and even subjective, is quite unstable. And this instability of mass prosperity that is common for us in Russia today can also reduce the effect of mobility, because if movement up or down the social ladder is perceived not as mobility but as volatility of the position of as an instability, and there is a general predominance of downward trajectories, then the universal demand for redistribution is quite understandable. So finally, turning back to the this metaphor of the tunnel effect, we think that we see from our study that in current Russia, it is unimportant who is moving in a traffic jam or a tunnel, which line, at what speed, or how the driver was moving before he got into this tunnel. The perception of the situation depends on ideas about what will happen in the next half an hour, so in a very short period of time, short-term future, and even to a greater extent on the subjective assessments of the situation on the roads in general. So compliance of people with the traffic rules, its fairness of the traffic rules, and especially including existence of those who do not pay attention to these rules and can move against the traffic with flashing lights and break this very rule. So this very top who is very different from the other population. Thank you, and I will be happy to answer any questions you might have, as well as my colleagues who are present here.
Thank you very much. Our next presentation is by Daria Matvienko on the optimal level of state debt and wealth inequality.
I hope that you can hear me well. So my paper is the optimal level of government debt and wealth inequality, or more precisely, how the increase, for example, of government debt can increase or reduce inequality. So what is the fiscal effect, like the effect on wealth inequality of the fiscal policy? So why I'm motivated by the question? Because there are rising concerns about increase in government debt in many countries. It's even not because of the COVID pandemic in 2020. So as we can see that the government debt was rising for the next for a couple of years before the pandemic, and the same trend is in many developed and developing countries. So as well as we have the trend of the increase of wealth and income inequalities, not only in the United States, but in many other countries. But why I'm focusing on the United States, because of the high availability of the income and wealth data in this country. How probably like not all income, but with the high people. And have a flat right tail of the income and wealth distribution. So we can see on this graph that distribution of wealth and income are highly non-normal and even not log normal, with a fat Pareto tail usually. So my question is, what is the optimal level of the government debt and how the fiscal policy affects inequality? So we all know that in order to assess the effect of fiscal policy on individuals, we cannot agree with just a representative agent model. We need to assess the effect of fiscal policy on many agents with different incomes and different wealth levels. So it is really important to use heterogeneous agent model and to assess the effect of government debt on it. So usually the literature addresses this question using discrete time models, but because of the availability of great computational methods in continuous time, I will use this one, and it really differs from from the majority of literature which was done before this heterogeneous agent model and government debt. So I will use meaningful game approach so that we have many ex-ante the same agents with like some incomes and wealth, but because of some idiosyncratic shocks and borrowing constraints, we have different agents. Because, for example, I have some probability of getting richer, I can have some probability that I will be fired from a job, or I will run my own business and it will be very successful. So we all have many idiosyncratic shocks which hit us every day. So because of this borrowing constraints of the financial friction, people cannot ensure perfectly their incomes. So the precautionary savings motif arises. So the good thing about this model is that I can have, for example, discretized income distribution. So I can have it from the data, and the model which I build allows me to have the endogenous wealth distribution from the model, and it can have meaningful policy experiments. And also to calibrate the logarithm of labor demands, I don't use just or like incomes, I don't use just log normal distribution, but I have air process with a mixture of normals, which gives me more precise discretization of income process. So in comparison with many other papers, I mean, which were presented today, I will have a theoretical model, but I will give you some results. So the answer to the question, what is the optimal level of government debt, is 120, 140%, depending on the specification. So I will explain you what is the like the idea of the optimal debt. So at first, I just wanted to say that there are many papers regarding this question about heterogeneous agent model, but as I mentioned, they are in discrete time, which is much less efficient, and like there are many papers which consider, for example, only idiosyncratic shocks, but there are few of them which consider aggregate shocks because of the technical difficulties. And also there are many opportunities, for example, to consider steady state level of debt, or also transition dynamics, and like after some shocks. And as you can see from the literature, the answer to this question is ambiguous, because depending on the specification, we can have, for example, from I know minus 300 to somewhere like 1,000. So it depends whether we can, for example, accumulate debt or accumulate stabilization fund. So we have like negative value of government debt. And there are also, like as I mentioned, there are papers in discrete time, in continuous time, but there are no papers which are in continuous time with a modern approach, which address like this issue of the optimal level of government debt. And I will explain in which specification, like optimal. And of course, there are many concerns about income and wealth inequality. I will share my presentation with you so that you can easily see like all the papers and etc. So the idea of the optimal level of government debt is that we have a positive effect and negative effect. So if we increase the government debt increases, interest rate rises because of more supply of government debt, and capital is crowded out. So there are like a good and bad effects. So because interest rate increases, people can, for example, put their money like to buy government bonds, and they will have higher returns. So, for example, they can accumulate more income returns, and it allows them to smooth their consumption over time. And if we have like idiosyncratic shocks to the incomes of people, if the capital is crowded out, output is crowded out, we have less variability because of these idiosyncratic shocks, because like the base of the shock is decreased, so income decreases. And it allows to smooth consumption over time to agents. And also, if the government debt increases, we can have more transfers to people, which is especially important when we have like disasters like pandemic. And of course, we have a negative effect. If we have a sustainable debt, there is a distortionary effect of the income taxation. So and the capital is crowded out, output decreases. So we have like a pros and cons of increase of government debt. So in general, when the government debt increases, welfare is increased somehow, and also it is important that the wealth inequality is decreased if the government debt increases. But because of this distortion effect of taxation, there are, like, after some increase of government debt, there are more cons than pros. So I will briefly maybe go to the model itself. So it's a closed economy model, and I will just briefly explain the government constraint maybe. So A is wealth. So the dynamics of I'm sorry for the noise. So the dynamics of wealth is that we have wealth, which is the return on wealth here, and after tax. Sorry. Just a second because of the noise. Sorry. And we have also income, which is after tax also, minus consumption plus transfers. So it is the dynamics of wealth, and we have also, it is quite shock to our incomes. So then I have just two equations. It is Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation, which governs the value function of the agent, and if we want to compute the wealth distribution, we have to compute density function, and it is made through Kolmogorov-Horowitz equation. So I will just briefly go to the challenges. If we have only like idiosyncratic income shocks, we cannot match the fat tail of wealth distribution. That is why I have an update to this model, and I introduced the risky capital, which can be like the risky capital, okay, and that allows me to have this fat tail distribution because of more diffusion to the wealth of the agents. Maybe I'll just go to results because I don't have time for this.
Yes, you have 3 minutes.
Yeah. So let me explain maybe the results. So I have the basic model. It is Iagari-McGrattan, like it is very old, which was made in discrete time. So the specification is almost the same. And we can see here that like it is the level of government debt, and these are like the welfare. So we can see that the optimal level of government debt is somewhere like 66%. What I have here is that I compute that the optimal level of government debt if I have no like risky capital, like both government bonds and capital, which is like used by the firm, are risk-free. We have that the government debt is under 20%, and we have such a wealth distribution. So the main result, how government debt affects wealth distribution. We can see here that the red line is when we have like 0% of government debt. So it is when the welfare is not so high, right? And that when we have, for example, 150%, which is more close to the optimal level, we can see that there are less people which are in the borrowing constraint. So we have here A is wealth, and this is a density function. We can see that if we have a borrowing constraint, that people cannot have a negative wealth. When government debt increases, we can see that the distribution of wealth becomes less unequal. So the concentration of people near the borrowing constraint, they are poor people, like in this model, there are less such people in the economy. So the government debt has wealth like improving effect, like reducing wealth inequality. And if I have like a disaster risk, for example, when there is pandemic, which is like somewhere like once in 10 years or one in 20 years, important result here is that the level of government debt, so this is without shock and this is with the shock, we can see here that the optimal level of government debt is 20%. So when we know that when we have an opportunity that the pandemic will hit, it's not a good idea to over accumulate debt. So it is important to have like something like fiscal buffer, because otherwise we will later have to increase our taxes incredibly. So let me be finished. I will also send you a presentation, but I wanted to say that I computed the heterogeneous items in model in continuous time, which allowed me to understand how the fiscal policy can decrease the wealth inequality. And also I computed that the government debt to GDP varies from 120 to 140% if we don't, for example, have some jump shock, and depends on the model specification whether we have a portfolio choice with a risk-free capital and debt, or some risky capital also. And I want also to consider strategic default option in this model, but because US is government bonds in the US are considered as risk-free, it is not important here. But if we want to consider developing countries, we can really consider strategic default. So if we want to consider like different countries, we can just change parameters of the model. We can change the parameters of income distribution, and we can have a policy experiments for different countries. So maybe that is all, and I will really welcome your questions. I understand that everything was short and quick, but I will definitely share the presentation now.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a couple of questions. The first questions to Dr. Marieva. The tunnel effect is twofold. First phase, people are happy of the upward move of the fastest, and the second, the slow ones are frustrated because they're stuck in the tunnel. Would it be possible to disentangle the two phases for the two populations, those who benefit and those who have to wait? And when is the first wave of survey with micro data on inequality and sentiment of justice?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It is an interesting point. We have a data from 90s, so it might be interesting to check the presence of tunnel effect in earlier years. However, we see that the demand for distribution was quite high also in the 90s, and the tunnel effect was seen only for the population who was quite well off. So among them, those who expected the situation to worsen, the demand for distribution was higher. But later, even the well-off population, as we can see, joined the mass population of Russia in general dissatisfaction with the state of inequalities. So now we think that the problem is not with the share of those who have to stay and who have to go forward. The problem is that 99% of the population have to stay in their place. They do not expect, they do not feel that they have real social mobility. Their social mobility doesn't match their expectation, and they show general dissatisfaction with this 1% or even less, who are moving fast, who are moving forward very, very fast. So I think it's a bit different problem, and I'm not sure we can disentangle it from the data that we have. But it is very interesting, and we'll look at the earlier data as well. Thank you.
The next question is to Daria Matvienko. Do you agree that Russia has a relatively small government debt? According to your model, do we have room to optimally increase it with no or scarce effects on poverty and inequality?
Yes, it's true that Russia has relatively small government debt, which accounts like 21% like in a couple of years. So I didn't consider the data of Russia because like the plus of US is that it has quite rich data for income inequality in comparison with Russia because of a big fraction of shadow economy. But actually I think so that it is possible to increase the government debt in Russia and reduce inequality a bit. Because we have quite a strong demand on government bonds by of the Ministry of Finance, like by Russian banks and institutions. So I don't think that it will be a problem. Yes, there is a problem that, for example, the share of non-residents and foreign citizens in the Russian debt is decreasing nowadays, so that there will be less demand from abroad. But I think that it is really possible, and it will be interesting to discretize the income process in Russia and to understand whether we can increase the debt. So what is the optimal level of debt in Russia? But I didn't consider Russia here for now, but it will be really interesting to do it.
Okay, colleagues, we don't have any more questions, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think I see them. So we are, since we are over time, I will sacrifice my wrap-up comments. I think that this has been incredibly insightful session with lots of interesting and well-thought presentations, and they speak for themselves. And I believe some of you have already shared your presentations, and I'm sure you will all be in touch with each other if you have further follow-ups. Thank you all, and thank you especially to the presenters and also to the audience.
Thank you, Nisa, for your moderating the session.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Саш, вырубай трансляцию.